Thomas McKenna was mending a broken fence post when he saw her walking across his land like a shadow given form. The evening sun cast long fingers of light through the Oklahoma prairie, and for a moment he thought she might be a mirage, something his lonely mind had conjured from too many solitary days and sleepless nights. But as she drew closer to his modest ranch house, he could see she was real enough. A native woman, probably Cherokee from the reservation to the east, walking with the careful steps of someone who had traveled far on foot. Her dark dress was torn and dusty. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and even from a distance he could see she was hurt. Thomas set down his hammer and walked toward the house, arriving at his front porch just as she reached the bottom step. Up close, he could see the full extent of her condition: a cut above her left eye, bruises on her arms, exhaustion written in every line of her body. She looked up at him with dark eyes that held more pain than any person should have to carry, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Please," she said in accented English, "I need help." Thomas McKenna had lived alone on his small ranch for 15 years, ever since his wife Sarah had died of pneumonia. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, to the rhythm of his own thoughts and the company of his cattle and horses. He wasn't a man given to quick decisions or grand gestures, but looking at this woman, seeing the desperation and dignity she carried in equal measure, he felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant for years. "Come inside," he said simply, stepping back to hold the door open. She climbed the steps slowly, favoring her left leg, and paused at the threshold. "I don't want to bring trouble to your house." "Trouble's already here if you need help," Thomas replied. "The question is what we do about it." She nodded once and entered his home, which suddenly seemed smaller and shabbier than usual. The single room that served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting room was clean but sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, shelves lined with supplies, and a few books. Sarah's influence had long since faded from the space, leaving only the practical arrangements of a man who lived for necessity rather than comfort. Thomas guided her to one of the chairs and brought her a cup of water from the pitcher on his table. She drank it gratefully, and he could see some of the tension leave her shoulders. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Mary," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Mary Crowfeather," Thomas nodded. "I'm Thomas McKenna. This is my ranch such as it is." He gestured around the modest space. "You said you needed help. What kind of help?" Mary looked down at her hands, which were wrapped around the cup. "My husband was killed 3 days ago. Men came to our cabin at night, said we were trespassing on land that belonged to someone else. When he tried to reason with them..." She stopped, her voice catching. Thomas felt anger kindle in his chest. He'd heard stories like this before. Cherokee families being driven from their homes by men who claimed legal right to land that had been Cherokee for generations. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Do you know who these men were?" "White men, well-dressed. One had a badge." Mary looked up at him with eyes that held both grief and determination. "They burned our cabin, took our horses, told me to get off their land or share my husband's fate." Thomas was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "And you've been walking since then?" "Yes, I was trying to reach my brother's family on the reservation, but..." She gestured toward her injured leg. "I couldn't go any further." Thomas could see that she was at the end of her strength. Her hands shook slightly as she held the cup, and her breathing was shallow with exhaustion. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "Rest and recover your strength. We'll figure out what to do in the morning." Mary studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether his offer was genuine. "Why would you help me?" "You don't know me." It was a fair question, and Thomas considered it seriously. Why was he offering shelter to a woman he'd never seen before, in a territory where tensions between white settlers and native tribes ran high, where helping the wrong person could bring serious consequences? "My wife used to say that kindness was the only thing that mattered in the end," he said finally. "I reckon she was right." Mary's eyes softened slightly. "Where is your wife now?" "Dead these past 15 years. Fever took her." Thomas stood up and moved to a chest in the corner of the room. "I've got some salve that might help with those cuts. And there's a bed in the back room you can use." "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will," Thomas said firmly but kindly. "I've slept in the chair plenty of times. Won't hurt me to do it again." As he tended to Mary's injuries with the careful attention he'd once given his wife, Thomas found himself thinking about the men who had killed her husband. Men with badges who burned down cabins and called it justice. Men who would sleep well tonight while a widow walked the prairie with nowhere to go. It was then, as he helped Mary settle into the back room, that he first heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. "Do you hear that?" Mary asked, her voice tight with fear. Thomas listened carefully. The sound was faint but unmistakable, multiple horses moving at a steady pace toward his ranch. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." Thomas took his rifle from the gun rack by the door and stepped out onto his front porch. The evening was clear and still, the kind of night when sound carried for miles across the prairie. The hoofbeats were getting closer. He settled into his rocking chair, rifle across his knees, and prepared to wait for whatever was coming. The riders appeared on the horizon just as the last light faded from the western sky. Thomas could make out their silhouettes against the stars, 4 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful pace of people who knew exactly where they were going. He checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready, then settled deeper into his chair. The wooden boards of his porch creaked softly as he rocked, a sound that had comforted him through many lonely evenings. Tonight it felt like the only normal thing in a world that had suddenly become dangerous. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the house, just at the edge of the light cast by the lamp in his window. Thomas could see they were white men, well-dressed as Mary had described, with the confident posture of people accustomed to getting their way. "Evening," called out the man in front. "We're looking for a Cherokee woman, about 30 years old, traveling alone. You seen anyone like that?" Thomas continued rocking steadily, his hands relaxed on the rifle. "Evening to you, too. Might I ask who's doing the asking?" "Name's Harrison. I work for the Cherokee Land Development Company. We have reason to believe this woman is trespassing on company property." Thomas had heard of the Cherokee Land Development Company, a group of businessmen who claimed to have legal rights to various parcels of Cherokee land. Their claims were often disputed, but they had money and lawyers which counted for more than justice in the Oklahoma Territory. "Can't say as I've seen anyone like that," Thomas said easily. "Been working on my fence all day. Pretty quiet out here." Harrison urged his horse closer, close enough that Thomas could see the man's face in the lamplight. He had the smooth features of someone who'd never done a day's hard labor, and eyes that held the cold calculation of a man who saw everything in terms of profit and loss. "You sure about that, McKenna? Because we tracked her this far, and your place is the only shelter for miles." Thomas stopped rocking. "You know my name. I know a lot of things. I know you've been struggling to make payments on this land. I know the bank's been patient with you, but patience runs out. I also know that harboring a fugitive could complicate your situation considerably." The threat was clear, but Thomas had faced worse than threats in his 53 years. During the war, he'd held positions against Confederate charges with nothing but determination and a loaded rifle. This felt remarkably similar. "Fugitive?" Thomas asked mildly. "Thought you said she was trespassing." "Trespassing, theft, destruction of property. The charges can be whatever we need them to be." Harrison's voice hardened. "The point is she belongs to us, McKenna. If she's here, you need to turn her over." "Belongs to you?" Thomas's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Last I heard, slavery was outlawed in these parts." One of the other riders, a younger man with nervous energy, spoke up. "She's a murderer, McKenna. Killed 3 men before she ran. You're harboring a dangerous criminal." Thomas looked at the young man steadily. "That so? Funny, because she told me her husband was killed 3 nights ago. Unless she raised him from the dead just to kill him again, your story doesn't add up." Harrison held up a hand to quiet his companion. "The woman is confused, possibly delusional from grief. She's not thinking clearly, and she's definitely not safe to be around. For everyone's sake, including hers, she needs to come with us. Where are you planning to take her?" "Back to the reservation where she belongs." Thomas nodded slowly. "Well, that's mighty considerate of you boys. But like I said, I haven't seen anyone matching her description." The standoff stretched on for several minutes, with Harrison clearly weighing his options. Thomas could see the man calculating the cost of forcing the issue versus the benefit of retrieving one Cherokee widow. The presence of the rifle across Thomas's knees was obviously part of that calculation. Finally, Harrison turned his horse around. "We'll be checking with the other ranches in the area, McKenna. If we find out you lied to us..." Then you'll know where to find me," Thomas finished calmly. The four men rode away into the darkness, but Thomas knew they wouldn't go far. He could feel their presence out there in the night, watching and waiting for him to make a mistake. He remained in his chair for another hour, listening to the sounds of the prairie. When he was satisfied that the immediate threat had passed, he went inside to check on Mary. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard them," she said quietly. "I should leave. I'm putting you in danger." Thomas set his rifle against the wall and sat down in the chair across from her. "Mary, I want you to tell me something, and I want the truth. Did you kill anyone?" "No," her answer came without hesitation. "My husband tried to fight them when they came to burn our cabin. They shot him down like a dog. I ran into the woods and hid until they left." Thomas studied her face in the lamplight. 15 years of solitude had made him a good judge of character, and everything about this woman spoke of honesty and dignity. "Then you're staying," he said firmly. "Whatever those men want with you, it isn't justice. They'll come back, yes they will. And when they do, they'll find me waiting." Thomas stood up and moved toward the door. "You get some rest." "I'll keep watch." "Thomas," Mary called softly as he reached the doorway. "Why are you doing this?" He paused, thinking about her question. The honest answer was that he wasn't entirely sure. Maybe it was loneliness making him desperate for human connection. Maybe it was the memory of his wife's voice urging him to be kind. Maybe it was just that seeing this woman's pain had awakened something in him that had been sleeping too long, because it's the right thing to do, he said finally. Thomas returned to his porch and settled back into his rocking chair. The night was going to be long, and he suspected it was only the beginning of a much longer ordeal. But for the first time in years, he felt like his life had purpose beyond mere survival. Near midnight, Thomas heard the soft sound of bare feet on wooden floors. Mary appeared in the doorway, moving carefully on her injured leg. "Can't sleep," she said quietly. Thomas nodded toward the other chair on the porch. "Join me. Might be safer with 2 pairs of eyes watching." Mary settled into Sarah's old chair, the first person to sit in it since his wife had died. The thought should have bothered him, but somehow it felt right. "Tell me about your husband," Thomas said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. Mary was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft with memory. His name was Joseph. Joseph Crowfeather. He was a good man, patient, kind, hardworking. He believed that if we lived quietly, caused no trouble, they would leave us alone. She laughed bitterly. "He was wrong. How long were you married?" 8 years. We had a small cabin on 20 acres that his grandfather had farmed before the government took most of our land. Joseph raised cattle, grew corn and beans. We were happy. Thomas could hear the love in her voice, and it stirred memories of his own marriage. "Sarah and I had 12 years together," he found himself saying. "Not nearly enough." "The Cherokee Land Development Company," Mary continued. "They showed up 6 months ago with papers saying our land was legally theirs. Joseph tried to fight it through the courts, but..." She spread her hands helplessly. "We had no money for lawyers. They had plenty. So they just decided to take it by force? They gave us 30 days to vacate. Joseph refused to leave the land his family had worked for generations. That's when they came with guns." Thomas felt his anger building again. He'd seen too much of this in the Oklahoma Territory. Legal theft dressed up as business development. Men with money and connections taking what they wanted from people who had no power to stop them. "What about your family? Do you have anyone who can help?" Mary nodded. "My brother lives on the reservation with his wife and children, but..." She hesitated. "There's something you should know. Joseph wasn't just a farmer. He was also a leader among our people. He spoke for the Cherokee families who refused to give up their land rights." Thomas turned to look at her more closely. "What kind of leader?" "He organized resistance to the land seizures. Legal resistance, petitions, protests, appeals to federal authorities. But his words carried weight among the Cherokee. Many families looked to him for guidance. Understanding dawned on Thomas. That's why they killed him. Not just for the land, but to send a message to anyone else who might resist. Yes, and that's why they want me so badly. Joseph shared everything with me. Names, plans, legal strategies. I know which government officials they've bribed, which judges are in their pocket, how they falsify deeds and land claims." Thomas let out a low whistle. Mary, you're not just a widow seeking shelter. You're sitting on evidence that could bring down the entire Cherokee Land Development Company. Evidence that died with Joseph if I don't survive to tell. The weight of the situation settled on Thomas like a physical burden. This wasn't just about offering temporary shelter to someone in need. This was about taking a stand against systematic injustice, about risking everything for a principle that most people would consider foolish. There's more, Mary said quietly. Joseph sent word to the Cherokee Nation Council before he died. He told them that if anything happened to him, they should look for me. He said I would carry on his work. Meaning what exactly? Meaning that by now every Cherokee leader in the territory knows that Joseph Crowfeather is dead, and his wife is missing. They'll be looking for me. Thomas absorbed this information slowly. How many Cherokee are we talking about? In the territory? Thousands. But the ones actively involved in land rights resistance, Mary paused, calculating. Maybe 300 families. And they're organized. As if summoned by her words, a new sound drifted across the prairie, the distant thunder of many horses moving at speed. Thomas stood up quickly, his rifle in his hands. That's not Harrison and his boys, he said grimly. Mary rose beside him, her face pale in the moonlight. No, that's something much bigger. The sound grew louder and Thomas began to make out individual hoofbeats. Lots of them. More horses than he'd ever heard moving together at one time. Mary, he said carefully, exactly how important was your husband to the Cherokee Nation? She looked at him with eyes that suddenly held a mixture of pride and sorrow. Thomas, my husband wasn't just a leader. He was the son of a chief, grandson of one of the Cherokee who survived the Trail of Tears. His death... She swallowed hard. His death is an act of war against our people. The hoofbeats were getting closer, and Thomas realized that whatever was coming toward his ranch was going to change everything. The quiet life he'd built, the solitude he'd grown comfortable with, the simple existence of a poor rancher trying to make ends meet, all of that was about to end. But as he looked at the woman beside him, seeing the dignity she carried even in her grief, he found that he wasn't afraid. Well then, he said quietly, I guess we better be ready to meet them. The sound of 300 horses approaching in the pre-dawn darkness was like nothing Thomas had ever experienced. It was the sound of history in motion, of a people pushed too far finally pushing back. And somehow his small ranch had become the center of it all. The first riders appeared on the eastern ridge just as the sky began to show the faintest hint of dawn. Thomas squinted through his binoculars, a pair he'd owned since the war, and felt his breath catch in his throat. Warriors. Cherokee warriors in traditional dress and war paint, mounted on painted horses carrying rifles and bows. They moved with the fluid precision of men who had grown up in the saddle, spreading out along the ridgeline like a dark wave against the lightening sky. Jesus, Thomas whispered. More riders appeared on the southern ridge, then the western one. Within minutes, Thomas could see that his ranch was being surrounded by the largest gathering of Cherokee warriors he'd ever witnessed. They took positions with military precision, forming concentric circles that effectively cut off every escape route. Mary stood beside him on the porch, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Despite everything, she seemed calmer than he felt. They're not here to hurt you, she said quietly. They're here for me. All of them? Mary nodded. When word spread that Joseph was dead and I was missing, every Cherokee family that lost land to the company would have sent their men. Every family that has been threatened, cheated, driven from their homes. Thomas lowered the binoculars and looked at her. You knew this would happen. I hoped it would. Joseph always said that if the worst happened, our people would come together. I didn't expect it to be so many. The warriors continued to arrive, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard earth. Thomas tried to count them but gave up when he reached 200 and they were still coming. The rising sun caught the metal of their weapons and the colors of their war paint, creating a sight that was both beautiful and terrifying. Thomas, Mary said softly, I need you to understand something. These men have come to honor my husband's memory and to ensure my safety. But they've also come to send a message to the Cherokee Land Development Company, and anyone else who thinks Cherokee lives are expendable. What kind of message? Before Mary could answer, a new sound cut through the morning air, the thunder of horses approaching from the north. Thomas raised his binoculars again and saw a very different sight. A column of U.S. cavalry soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the prairie grass. "Now we've got company," he muttered. The cavalry column was perhaps 40 men strong, riding hard toward the ranch. At their head was an officer whose bearing suggested high rank and considerable experience. The Cherokee warriors shifted slightly at the sight of the soldiers, but they held their positions. The message was clear. They weren't looking for a fight, but they weren't backing down either. Mary watched the approaching soldiers with a mixture of wariness and something that might have been hope. "Colonel Morrison," she said, recognizing the officer through the binoculars. "He's actually a fair man. He's tried to prevent some of the worst abuses against our people." The cavalry column stopped about 100 yards from the house, close enough to be clearly visible but far enough to avoid seeming immediately threatening. Colonel Morrison dismounted and walked forward alone, stopping at the edge of the porch. "Mrs. Crowfeather," he called out formally. "I'm Colonel James Morrison, Fort Gibson. I've come to speak with you about recent events." Mary stepped to the edge of the porch, Thomas beside her. "Colonel Morrison, I know who you are. Ma'am, I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Your husband was a man I respected greatly, even when we disagreed." Morrison's voice carried genuine regret. "I want you to know that his death is being investigated by federal authorities." "Investigated by whom?" Mary asked. "The same authorities who've been looking the other way while the Cherokee Land Development Company steals our land?" Morrison's face tightened slightly. "Ma'am, I understand your anger, but the situation here has escalated beyond anything that can be solved by violence. I count nearly 300 warriors on these ridges, and I've got reports of more Cherokee war parties converging on this area." Thomas found his voice. "Colonel, Mrs. Crowfeather is under my protection. She's asked for nothing more than shelter, and I've given it freely." Morrison turned his attention to Thomas, studying him carefully. "Mr. McKenna, isn't it? I've heard about you. Union veteran, been ranching here for 15 years, never caused trouble for anyone." "That's right. Then you understand the gravity of this situation. We're on the edge of something that could spiral out of control very quickly." Before Thomas could respond, another voice cut through the morning air. A Cherokee warrior had ridden down from the eastern ridge, stopping his painted horse about 20 yards from the porch. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with silver streaking his long black hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Sister," he called out to Mary in Cherokee, then switched to English. "We have come for you." Mary stepped forward, her back straight with pride. "Grey Wolf, I wondered if you would come. When we heard what happened to Joseph, every Cherokee family in the territory sent their best men. We will not let his murderers go unpunished." Colonel Morrison stepped forward carefully. "Chief Grey Wolf, I presume?" "I was hoping we might be able to discuss this situation reasonably." Grey Wolf's dark eyes fixed on the colonel with undisguised hostility. "There is nothing to discuss, soldier. Our people have been murdered, our land stolen, our families driven from their homes. The time for discussion has passed. What are you proposing instead?" Grey Wolf gestured toward the warriors surrounding the ranch. "Justice. The men who killed Joseph Crowfeather will answer for their crime. The Cherokee Land Development Company will return the lands they have stolen. The families they have displaced will be compensated." Morrison's face was grim. "Chief, you know I don't have the authority to make those kinds of decisions, and this show of force isn't going to help your cause with the territorial authorities." "Then perhaps," Grey Wolf said quietly, "the territorial authorities should have thought of that before they allowed our people to be murdered." Thomas found himself caught between admiration and concern as he watched this exchange. The Cherokee had clearly organized themselves with remarkable speed and discipline, but he could also see that the situation was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, could lead to bloodshed that would echo through the territory for years to come. But, as he looked at Mary, seeing the hope and pride in her face as she watched her people stand up for justice, he realized that some things were worth risking everything for. The question was whether courage and principle would be enough to prevent a war. The standoff stretched through the morning hours, with neither side willing to make the first move. Thomas found himself in the surreal position of serving coffee to Cherokee warriors and U.S. cavalry officers from the same pot, his small ranch having become neutral ground in a conflict that could reshape the Oklahoma Territory. Colonel Morrison had accepted Grey Wolf's invitation to dismount and discuss terms, a gesture that Thomas recognized as both brave and necessary. The two men sat on opposite ends of Thomas's porch, with Mary translating when needed and Thomas himself serving as an unofficial mediator. The federal investigation into Joseph Crowfeather's death is real, Morrison was saying. But these things take time. Justice through proper channels. Proper channels, Grey Wolf interrupted, his voice heavy with irony. Colonel, my people have been trying proper channels for 50 years. Since the Trail of Tears, we have filed petitions, hired lawyers, appealed to Congress. What has it gotten us? More stolen land? More broken promises? More dead leaders? Thomas watched the exchange while keeping an eye on the hundreds of warriors who maintained their positions on the surrounding ridges. Their discipline was impressive. They sat motionless on their horses despite hours in the saddle, weapons ready but not threatening, waiting for orders from their chief. Chief Grey Wolf, Morrison said carefully, I understand your frustration, but if violence breaks out here today, it will be Cherokee families who pay the ultimate price. The army will be forced to respond and you will kill more of us. Grey Wolf's voice was matter-of-fact. Yes, Colonel, we understand the mathematics of resistance. We have always understood them. Mary, who had been quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. There might be another way. Both men turned to look at her, and Thomas found himself holding his breath. Joseph kept detailed records of everything the Cherokee Land Development Company did, Mary continued. Names, dates, bribery payments, forged documents. He was preparing to present evidence to a federal grand jury when they killed him. Morrison leaned forward. Do you have these records? I know where they are hidden, but I'll only turn them over under certain conditions. What conditions? Grey Wolf asked. Mary stood up, her dignity evident despite her worn dress and bandaged injuries. First, the federal government must guarantee my safety and the safety of anyone who testifies about the company's crimes. Second, the investigation must be conducted by someone from outside the territory, someone who can't be bought by the company's money. Morrison nodded slowly. Those conditions might be acceptable. What else? Third, Mary continued, every Cherokee family that lost land to the company must be compensated fairly. Not relocated to worse land, not given empty promises, actually compensated. And fourth? Grey Wolf asked, sensing there was more. Mary looked directly at Thomas. Fourth, the white families who have helped Cherokee people, who have shown honor when others showed greed, must also be protected. No retaliation, no economic pressure, no forced sales of their land. Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest. Even in her grief and fear, Mary was thinking about protecting him from consequences he hadn't even considered. Morrison studied the proposal. Mrs. Crowfeather, you're essentially asking me to guarantee that the federal government will take on one of the most powerful business interests in the territory. Yes, Mary said simply. I am. And if I can't make those guarantees? Grey Wolf answered before Mary could speak. Then we will make our own justice, Colonel. Here today, starting with the men who killed Joseph Crowfeather. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Thomas could see Morrison calculating odds, weighing the cost of immediate conflict against the political complications of the alternatives. I'll need to send telegrams, Morrison said finally. Contact my superiors, get authorization for the kind of investigation you're describing. How long? Grey Wolf asked. Give me until sunset. If I can get the guarantees you want, will you agree to pursue this through legal channels? Grey Wolf looked at Mary, who nodded slightly. If the guarantees are real with real consequences for breaking them, then yes. But understand, Colonel, this is the last time my people will trust in white man's justice. If this fails, if there are more delays and broken promises, then we will handle things our own way. Morrison stood up, his decision made. I'll need to ride to Fort Gibson to send the telegrams. That's a 4-hour round trip. Can you maintain this gathering until I return? We will wait, Grey Wolf said, but only until sunset. As Morrison prepared to leave with half his men, keeping the others as a sign of good faith, Thomas found himself alone with Mary on the porch. The Cherokee warriors remained in position, but the immediate tension had eased slightly. That was well done, Thomas said quietly, offering them a way out that doesn't involve bloodshed. Mary shook her head. I didn't offer them a way out, Thomas. I offered them a choice. Justice through law or justice through war. Either way, there will be justice for Joseph. Thomas looked out at the warriors surrounding his ranch, their painted faces impassive in the afternoon sun. And if Morrison can't deliver on those guarantees? Then by tomorrow morning, the Cherokee Land Development Company will no longer exist, Mary said with quiet certainty. And neither will anyone who worked for them. Thomas understood then that he wasn't just sheltering a grieving widow. He was harboring the catalyst for a revolution that had been building for decades. The question was whether the forces he'd set in motion could be channeled toward justice, or whether they would explode into a violence that would consume everyone in its path. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, 300 Cherokee warriors waited for an answer that would determine the future of the Oklahoma Territory. And Thomas McKenna, poor rancher and unlikely protector, found himself at the center of it all. Colonel Morrison returned just as the sun touched the western horizon, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Thomas watched him approach, noting the mix of exhaustion and determination in the officer's bearing. The Cherokee warriors shifted slightly at Morrison's arrival, their horses dancing with the tension that had been building all day. Gray Wolf rode down from his position on the ridge, his face impassive as he waited to hear what the colonel had learned. Morrison dismounted and walked directly to the porch where Mary and Thomas waited. His first words carried across the prairie in the still evening air. "Mrs. Crowfeather, I have authorization from the Department of Justice to offer you full federal protection in exchange for your testimony and your husband's evidence." A murmur ran through the Cherokee warriors, the sound like wind through grass. The investigation will be led by Federal Marshal Samuel Curtis from Kansas, a man with no connections to the Oklahoma Territory or the Cherokee Land Development Company, Morrison continued. He'll arrive within the week with a full team of federal investigators. Gray Wolf had reached the porch. And the other conditions? Morrison met his eyes directly. Every Cherokee family that can prove their land was taken illegally will receive full compensation at current market rates. The federal government will also establish a legal aid office in the territory specifically to help Cherokee families defend their land rights. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. These weren't empty promises, they were specific, actionable commitments. And the fourth condition? Mary asked quietly. Any individual who assisted Cherokee families during this crisis will receive federal protection against retaliation. That includes economic pressure, legal harassment, or physical threats. Gray Wolf studied Morrison's face carefully. These promises, they come from Washington? Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a telegram, directly from the Attorney General's office. I'm authorized to put it in writing if you need a formal document. For several long moments, the only sound was the evening wind across the prairie. Thomas could see Mary wrestling with the decision, weighing her desire for justice against her people's need to avoid a war they might not survive. There's one more thing, Morrison said quietly. The men who killed your husband, we know who they are. Harrison and 3 others. They'll be arrested within the hour. Mary's composure finally cracked. Tears ran down her cheeks as she gripped the porch railing. Joseph will have justice? He will have justice, as Morrison confirmed. Gray Wolf dismounted and walked up onto the porch, stopping directly in front of Thomas. The old chief's dark eyes studied Thomas with the intensity of someone reading a man's soul. White man, Gray Wolf said formally, you gave shelter to our sister in her time of need. You risked your own safety to protect her when you owed her nothing. This is the behavior of a true warrior. Thomas felt uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what seemed right. Yes, Gray Wolf said. You did what was right when it would have been easier to do nothing. My people will remember this. The chief turned to address the warriors surrounding the ranch. His voice carried clearly in the evening air as he spoke in Cherokee. His words met with nods and murmurs of agreement. I have told them, he explained to Thomas, that you are now under the protection of the Cherokee Nation. Your cattle, your land, your family, if you ever have one again, will be safe as long as the Cherokee people exist. Thomas was overwhelmed by the gesture. Chief, that's not necessary. It is necessary, Gray Wolf said firmly. Honor must be recognized and rewarded. Otherwise, there is no reason for people to choose honor. As the Cherokee warriors began to disperse, riding away in small groups toward their homes and families, Mary approached Thomas one final time. I'll be leaving in the morning, she said. The federal marshals want me in protective custody until the trials are over. Thomas nodded, surprised by how much the thought of her leaving affected him. In less than 24 hours, this woman had transformed his quiet existence into something that mattered beyond his own survival. Will you be safe? He asked. I think so. And Thomas, Mary paused, seeming to struggle with words. What you did last night, what you risked for me, it changed everything. Not just for me, but for my people. You showed that there are still white men who will stand up for what's right, even when it costs them. Thomas looked out at the departing warriors, their silhouettes dark against the evening sky. I'm not sure I did all that much. Just offered a roof and a chair. Mary smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. You offered hope, Thomas. You reminded us that not all white men are our enemies, that maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to share this land without destroying each other. As the last of the warriors disappeared over the ridges, Colonel Morrison prepared to escort Mary to Fort Gibson for her own protection. But before they left, Grey Wolf had one final gesture. The chief approached Thomas carrying a beautifully crafted tomahawk, its handle carved with intricate symbols and its blade polished to a mirror shine. This belonged to my grandfather, Grey Wolf said solemnly. He carried it during the Trail of Tears, and it has been passed down through 3 generations of Cherokee leaders. I give it to you now as a symbol of the bond between us. Thomas accepted the weapon with trembling hands, understanding the profound honor being bestowed upon him. Chief, I can't accept something so valuable. You can and you will, Grey Wolf said with the same firm kindness Thomas had shown Mary the night before. And someday, when you have a son or grandson who shows the same courage you showed last night, you will pass it on to him. As the sun set completely and the last of the visitors departed, Thomas found himself alone on his porch once again. But the solitude felt different now, not empty but full of possibility. 3 months later, Thomas received word that the trials had concluded. Harrison and his associates were sentenced to long prison terms for murder and fraud. The Cherokee Land Development Company was dissolved, its assets seized to pay restitution to the families they had cheated. Federal Marshal Curtis had done his job with the thorough professionalism Morrison had promised. Mary Crow Feather testified as the star witness, her husband's carefully documented evidence providing the foundation for convictions that sent shockwaves through the territorial government. Several judges and officials were also arrested on corruption charges, leading to reforms that would protect Cherokee land rights for years to come. But perhaps the most significant outcome was something that couldn't be measured in legal terms. Word of what had happened at Thomas McKenna's ranch spread throughout the Oklahoma Territory and beyond. The story of a poor white rancher who had risked everything to protect a Cherokee widow became a symbol of what was possible. When people chose honor over convenience, Cherokee, families began seeking out white neighbors who had shown them fairness and kindness, creating alliances that transcended racial lines. White settlers who had been uncertain about their Cherokee neighbors found themselves welcomed and protected by families. Grateful for any gesture of friendship, Thomas himself became something of a local celebrity, though he never sought the attention. Visitors would ride out to his ranch to hear the story firsthand, and he found himself reluctantly serving as an unofficial ambassador between the white and Cherokee communities. One day in late fall, as he was preparing for another Oklahoma winter, Thomas saw a familiar figure walking across his land. Mary Crow Feather approached his porch, but she looked different, stronger, more confident, wearing a dress of fine blue cloth that spoke of financial security. Mary, Thomas said, rising from his chair with genuine pleasure. You look well. I am well, Thomas. The federal government kept its promises. My family received compensation for our stolen land, and I've used Joseph's share to start a school for Cherokee children. She paused, studying his face. But I didn't come here to talk about business. What did you come here to talk about? Mary smiled that same radiant smile he remembered from months earlier. I came to ask if you might like some company for dinner, and maybe to discuss whether a lonely rancher and a Cherokee widow might find some happiness together. Thomas felt his heart skip in a way it hadn't since Sarah's death 15 years earlier. Mary, are you sure? People will talk. Let them talk, she said firmly. The Cherokee Nation has spoken. You are one of us now, for as long as you choose to be. And She hesitated, then continued with quiet courage. I think Joseph would want me to be happy again, and I think he would approve of my choice. As Thomas looked at this remarkable woman, seeing the strength that had carried her through loss and danger, the wisdom that had prevented a war, the beauty that came from a spirit that refused to be broken, he realized that his life was about to change again, but this time, The change promised not danger and conflict, but the possibility of love, family, and a future worth building. "I'd like that very much," he said quietly. Mary stepped onto the porch and sat down in Sarah's old chair, looking out over the prairie that had once seemed so lonely and was now full of promise. "Good," she said, reaching over to take his hand, "because I think we have a lot to talk about." As the sun set completely and the last of the visitors departed, Thomas found himself alone on his porch once again. But the solitude felt different now, not empty but full of possibility. 3 months later, Thomas received word that the trials had concluded. Harrison and his associates were sentenced to long prison terms for murder and fraud. The Cherokee Land Development Company was dissolved, its assets seized to pay restitution to the families they had cheated. Federal Marshal Curtis had done his job with the thorough professionalism Morrison had promised. Mary Crow Feather testified as the star witness, her husband's carefully documented evidence providing the foundation for convictions that sent shockwaves through the territorial government. Several judges and officials were also arrested on corruption charges, leading to reforms that would protect Cherokee land rights for years to come. But perhaps the most significant outcome was something that couldn't be measured in legal terms. Word of what had happened at Thomas McKenna's ranch spread throughout the Oklahoma Territory and beyond. The story of a poor white rancher who had risked everything to protect a Cherokee widow became a symbol of what was possible when people chose honor over convenience. Cherokee families began seeking out white neighbors who had shown them fairness and kindness, creating alliances that transcended racial lines. White settlers who had been uncertain about their Cherokee neighbors found themselves welcomed and protected by families, grateful for any gesture of friendship. Thomas himself became something of a local celebrity. Though he never sought the attention, visitors would ride out to his ranch to hear the story firsthand, and he found himself reluctantly serving as an unofficial ambassador between the white and Cherokee communities. One day in late fall, as he was preparing for another Oklahoma winter, Thomas saw a familiar figure walking across his land. Mary Crow Feather approached his porch, but she looked different, stronger, more confident, wearing a dress of fine blue cloth that spoke of financial security. "Mary," Thomas said, rising from his chair with genuine pleasure. "You look well." "I am well, Thomas. The federal government kept its promises. My family received compensation for our stolen land, and I've used Joseph's share to start a school for Cherokee children." She paused, studying his face. "But I didn't come here to talk about business." "What did you come here to talk about?" Mary smiled that same radiant smile he remembered from months earlier. "I came to ask if you might like some company for dinner, and maybe to discuss whether a lonely rancher and a Cherokee widow might find some happiness together." Thomas felt his heart skip in a way it hadn't since Sarah's death 15 years earlier. "Mary, are you sure?" "People will talk. Let them talk," she said firmly. "The Cherokee Nation has spoken. You are one of us now, for as long as you choose to be. And She hesitated, then continued with quiet courage. "I think Joseph would want me to be happy again, and I think he would approve of my choice." As Thomas looked at this remarkable woman, seeing the strength that had carried her through loss and danger, the wisdom that had prevented a war, the beauty that came from a spirit that refused to be broken, he realized that his life was about to change again. But this time, the change promised not danger and conflict, but the possibility of love, family, and a future worth building. "I'd like that very much," he said quietly. Mary stepped onto the porch and sat down in Sarah's old chair, looking out over the prairie that had once seemed so lonely and was now full of promise. "Good," she said, reaching over to take his hand, "because I think we have a lot to talk about." As the sun set over the Oklahoma Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas McKenna realized that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply open their door when someone needs help. The rest, as it turned out, was just the beginning of the story.